There's a growing battle between remote workers and companies trying to force them back into the office. Who's going to win? Stick around because in this video, we're going to break down remote workers and the companies that are trying to force them to come back in. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and today I want to break down the battle between remote workers and the companies that want them back in the office. As a corporate recruiter, a career coach, and somebody that's worked remote for a lot of his career with some of the world's largest and most well-known companies, I do know a thing or two about remote work. Now, I'm going to put my recruiter cap on and give you my opinion of what I think is happening in the labor market, specifically around remote work and whether or not forcing employees back into the office is going to be a good long-term strategy. But before we get too far into it, if you're interested in more videos just like this one directly from a corporate recruiter, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You might also want to hit that notification bell so that you don't miss any future posts. Got a ton of great content coming up. And the YouTube algorithm is set up to really favor that engagement. So any likes or comments that you want to leave would surely be appreciated. So let's look at remote work and how we kind of got where we are today. And even as recent as 2019, trying to find a remote job was like finding a needle in a haystack. It was kind of a mythical thing. And there's only a handful of industries or companies and job types that really favored remote first. Fortunately, recruiting has kind of always been a remote option in a lot of companies, but even more traditional companies wanted their recruiter sitting in the office. Now, of course, the pandemic comes along in 2020, and suddenly everybody's forced into a remote first workplace. And what companies found, or what I should say what employees found, is that you can work just as effectively remotely. And if you're somebody that has dealt with long commutes and all of these other things that are pretty undesirable, it became something people got accustomed to pretty quickly. And so as this whole great resignation period has happened, as people have reevaluated their relationship with work, we are seeing a lot more people demanding this remote first opportunity. And in a lot of traditional companies, leadership teams prefer having people face to face. I think partially because it is a traditional way of doing business, and especially in the older generations where that's really all they ever knew. This idea of working remote, it does seem to be foreign, and I think that there's an inherent distrust from upper management to the employee base that if you work remote, you're not effective, that you're not dedicated, that you're slacking off, and all these things that those of us who have been working remote for the last 2 to 3 years or longer know that that's just simply not true. In fact, I would argue that somebody that works remote has a harder time getting away from the workplace because it's harder to log out at the end of the night. You tend to work longer hours. You tend to be checking your emails at night. There's almost a sense of constant connection to your workplace because it's only in the other room, or in some cases sitting on your kitchen table. Furthermore, studies have shown that productivity is not impacted by the remote workplace. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's actually higher. So the claim that remote work doesn't work simply doesn't hold water. There's a lot of other positive things about working remote. People really enjoy that lack of commute and the cost that is associated with it, especially with gasoline prices where they are right now, commuter expenses, and physically the time that it takes to get from one place to another. I've had really long commutes in my career. Fortunately, I worked mostly remote, so when I had to make the commute, it wasn't all that bad. But at one point, I had a door-to-door time I would leave my house to the time I walked into and sat down at my desk in the office. It was nearly 2 hours. And again, fortunately, I didn't have to do that all the time. And if I would had to have done that all the time, I would have probably not lasted there very long. But that is a very real expense. You have the train costs, you have parking expenses. You tend to go out to eat more often when you're in an office setting. It's pretty easy for me to swing into a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts on my way to work because they probably pass 3 or 4 of them. And well, let's face it, that's an expense that adds up, especially if you're not paying close attention to it. And then there's the whole thing about not having to maintain a wardrobe. And I've had to think, if I had to go back into an office on the regular basis, I would basically have to get an entirely new wardrobe, not only from the extra pounds you put on from being remote first, but my clothes are all pretty old now. It's a very real and big expense, and it's kind of nice to not have to worry about that. And in a lot of cases, you can wear your PJs all day if you want to. Then, of course, there's the geographic flexibility. There's some people that work in areas that simply don't have a lot of job options. And suddenly, a remote first economy allows people who traditionally didn't have access to great jobs now have really been able to expand their career possibilities. Similarly, people that live in very high cost of living areas or less desirable areas now have the chance to move away and have full-time employment, because that's usually been one of the barriers to moving to a new location. That happened to me because I was able to relocate when I had a remote job. And ultimately, people who work remotely get to spend more time with their family. And I do have the pleasure of being able to work remote. And I would never trade the memories that I have of my kids who are very young being able to come in and visit me at my desk throughout my workday. Now, of course, in my family, there are boundaries. When daddy's at work and the door's closed, there's no disturbing me, but it is nice to have a surprise visitor in the form of a 2-year-old who wants to come and give you his toy. Now, of course, remote work isn't without its dark side. So we talked about the lack of turning off your computer, but there's also some other things that you should be aware of. The fact is that you're kind of treated like you're always on call, and it is hard for people to separate, especially when you haven't created clear and firm boundaries between your work and your personal life. It's very easy to let that time creep, and suddenly you're working 70, 80, 90 hours. And another real thing, and this is one of the things that some of these companies bring up, is if you're out of sight, you're essentially out of mind. And it does get harder to move up the corporate ladder when you don't have that face-to-face interaction. So I'm not discounting that that is not a very real thing. But for some people who choose to work remote, that's not important for them. They don't have the interest in moving up the career ladder, and that's perfectly okay. And let's be real, I think one of the big issues that's driving companies to try to get employees back to the office is the fact that they have paid for all of this space and it's not cheap, and suddenly half of their buildings are sitting empty. Like, I know when I worked at Amazon, there was a huge new building that was being built in downtown Nashville, and they wanted everybody to move back into this office. And I'm thinking to myself, like, yeah, it might be cool to go down there a day or two a week and see this beautiful new office, but that's a lot of office space for suddenly everybody being remote. And I can't imagine what they spent on it. It's at least an entire city block. It's massive. So what are some of these companies that are forcing their employees back to work, and what is their reason behind it? So there's actually a recent article in Fortune where Google is forcing their employees to come back to work at least 3 days per week, with 2 days being flex or remote. So it's essentially a hybrid model. Now, their previous HR chief comes on and actually has a pretty interesting perspective. So he says that your boss wants you to boil slowly like a frog so that you get back to the office, and that it'll be terrible for morale and productivity. So essentially what he means by this is Google is adopting a strategy where they're requiring people to come in slowly, return to work, this kind of blended hybrid model, and eventually over time they'll move back to 100% in the office. And it'll be so slow that people won't really recognize what's happening. Kind of like the proverbial frogs in a boiling pot. And if it's true, it could be a little sneaky, something to be aware of. And I think especially in how competitive tech recruiting is right now, there is a very real risk to moving away from a remote first work and forcing people back into an office, because people have a lot of options right now. And there are plenty of companies that are out there poaching people who are leaving because companies are forcing them back into the office. So if you're a company like Google who relies on a lot of software developers, that could be a competitive disadvantage. So how long will we stay in this ultra competitive labor market? I don't know, but when you have the economy showing signs of weakness, anything can happen. But as of today, it's a competitive disadvantage. And you have companies like Facebook, I guess they go by Meta now, who are trying to take advantage of this and allowing people to continue to work remotely wherever they want. And then there's companies like Apple who are also trying to get people back into the offices. And then on the other coast, you have some more extreme positions. And it's not surprising that these are very traditional industries, particularly banking and finance, who are very adamant about getting people back into an office. And Goldman Sachs has come up recently in the news by requiring or forcing people back into the office 5 days a week. So there's no hybrid option. And you have junior bankers who are threatening to quit. And how Goldman Sachs is trying to enforce this is the eyebrow raising aspect of it, where they're actually utilizing the swiping in and out of the building to show how much time you're spending in the office. And if you're not swiping in as much as you're supposed to, and at the hours that you're supposed to be swiping in at, you can expect a call from your boss and enter into progressive discipline. Because Goldman Sachs' CEO, David Solomon, has rather infamously declared that he is requiring all people to come back to the office, that office work is an aberration and something that he's looking to correct as soon as possible. And I know there's some other financial services companies that are requiring the same thing to force people back into the office. So I'm wondering, from a recruiting perspective, you've got these very traditional companies who are forcing people to come back into the office in the banking industry, big kind of traditional established tech, and they're really playing poker in today's labor market. Because as everybody knows, as I record this video, we're in a very tight labor market, and there's a lot of options, especially for high performing employees who have very niche skill sets. Software developers come to mind. Now, I'm not as familiar with banking, so I don't know how much leverage there is there. But at the end of the day, it'd be very interesting to see how this pans out, because I know if I'm recruiting for a competitor to Goldman Sachs or one of the big tech firms, I'm certainly using the return to office piece to my advantage. So it could be a chance for some of these smaller companies who have traditionally struggled competing against these bigger companies to finally make some headway in that talent market. So I'll continue to pay attention to the story. I find it very fascinating. It's kind of like, again, this pendulum that swings back and forth between the employee and the company, and it's been very slanted towards the company for a long period of time. Finally, employees are getting a little bit more power back to them, and now it's this struggle. So it's really interesting to just pay attention to what's happening. And if you're somebody that's struggling and would love to find a remote job, or even any job, that's actually something that I specialize in. I've got a website called alifeafterlayoff.com, and it's loaded with tips and tricks, all from an insider's perspective. And I share some of my deepest and most intimate knowledge in the form of some training courses. Specifically, I've got a course called Resume Rocketfuel that teaches you exactly how to write a resume that's going to give you the best chance of getting a recruiter to notice you to get that first round interview. And once you get that first round interview, then it's up to you to sell yourself throughout the rest of the interviewing process. And that's where the ultimate job seeker bootcamp comes in. So it's going to take you through each step of that interview process. It's going to teach you exactly how to ace each step and then ultimately land your dream offer. So if you're somebody that's struggling, I would highly encourage you to check it out. I've got lots more courses coming your way, so just stay tuned for that. I also offer some limited private one-on-one coaching. You can also reach me through my website for that. Hey, appreciate you watching. Happy remote or returning to the officing for you, and we will see you on the next one.